influences landscape. What I do have in connection with the Burren is 40 years experience of looking at the Burren, both from above ground but also underground, and looking at it from a geological point of view, trying to understand the landscape by looking at the geology. My first visit to the Burren was in 1979. I came here to go caving. At that stage, I'd been caving for a couple of years, and the club I was in had planned to go to Switzerland, go caving in Switzerland, but for some reason that trip was cancelled, and as an alternative, we came to the Burren. And I suppose that little twist of fate had a big impact on the rest of my life. So I've been here for 40 years. For the last 30 years, I've been coming here for the last 40 years. For the last 30 years, I've been working in the building you can see on screen here. This is the Burren Outdoor Education Centre, which is run by Limerick and Clare Education and Training Board. So it's a residential centre set up mainly for school children, but we also cater for other groups, scout groups, youth groups, and even adult groups coming to visit the Burren, and hopefully we teach them a little bit about the landscape through different activities and different courses. I'm mainly involved in providing field study tuition for leaving certificate students in geography and biology. And also for the last 10 years, we've been running a geology course for local people, any people in the area who are interested in the geology. And we run this in conjunction with Dr. Eamon Doyle of the Burren and Cliffs of Moher UNESCO Global Geoparks, and that's been running for about 10 years, and it's been very successful. Positive feedback from that. So just to start, for anybody who's not familiar with the Burren, we're just with one of the classic views of the Burren, I suppose. This is in the National Park, down in the southeast corner of the Burren. Fabulous landscape. And if you're not familiar with the Burren, this is typical of what much of the area looks like. And straight away you can see that the landscape and the geology are almost the same thing. There's a huge amount of exposure of rock in the Burren. It's what it's most well known for. And you might think that because of this, the Burren will be a haven, a mecca for geologists to go to. But in actual fact, it's not. The geology of the Burren is quite simple. There's really only a couple of different types of rock, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. And the geological structures, the history of the area is relatively simple as well. So it's not a particularly interesting area for geologists, but these things make it a very interesting area to start learning about geology, because the rocks and the structures are fairly straightforward, and also they're really well exposed. You can see different types of rock, you can see the structures really clearly because of all this rock exposure. If you're new to geology, we're going to start with a little bit of an introduction just to get your brains thinking. The first thing you have to understand if you want to think about geology is the time scale involved. Geologists have to think about huge amounts of time, and there's a phrase which is being used a bit more now, deep time, which I'm not particularly keen on, but I do like this diagram. This diagram kind of shows how time, geological time, just swirls away back into the distance. On this diagram, you can see humans here. This is the start of the diagram, the present day here. You can see the human figure here. Just behind this figure, we've got a woolly mammoth representing the Ice Age, which geologically is only a fraction of time ago. As we go back around this diagram, we can see dinosaurs are cropping up here. And we're only just a short distance back around this first spiral. As we get to the end of that first spiral, we're looking at primitive fish, which evolved at that stage. We go around another full spiral or two, and we're back looking at the evolution of modern cells. Further back, we're looking at very primitive types of cells, the first types of cells that we can find in rocks. And then we go back onto the very oldest rocks on Earth, and we end up at 4.6 billion years ago, which is now the accepted figure for the age of the Earth. The age of the Earth has always been one of the big questions in geology, since geology started maybe 200 years ago as a science. This was always one of the big questions: how old was the Earth? And lots of different theories and different ideas have been used to measure that. But this figure now is fairly certain. It's based on radiometric dating, using tiny amounts of uranium, which are present in most rocks. Different samples have been tested now from different areas of the Earth, from moon rocks and from meteorites, and they're all coming back to agree on this figure of 4.6 billion years as the age of the Earth. And that's a vast amount of time, really impossible for humans to understand. Different ways that we can try and think about this. We could think about it as 1 year. A year obviously is something that as humans we can understand, but if we think about geological time as 1 year, then we're thinking about the origins of the solar system back on the 1st of January. The oldest rocks in Ireland didn't form until early in August. They're in Donegal. They're about almost 2 billion years old. The rocks of the Burren that we need to look at in a few minutes didn't form until the beginning of December. They were followed by extinction of the dinosaurs about the middle of December. And then the Roman Empire, human civilization as we know it, just in the last few minutes and seconds of December the 31st. So we do need to try and get an idea on this huge amount of time. But for the Burren, we don't need to know all of that period. A better way to think about geological time, and a more commonly used diagram, is a geological column like this. And in a geological column, the youngest rocks are at the top and the oldest rocks are at the bottom. So we go from top to bottom. And you can see that geological time is divided into different periods. And these have different names, and maybe this is another reason why people find geology difficult. There's lots of different names, and some of them a lot of them are based on Latin. So people find it difficult, but it's like any subject, any science, there's a language in it that we need to try and understand. Even this diagram is not particularly accurate. If we look at it, we can see modern day at the top here, the Quaternary, and a large part of this diagram brings us down to the bottom of the Cambrian, but that is actually only 550 million years ago. And we said the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. So the main part of geological time is this little block at the bottom of the diagram. And very often this is just called a Precambrian. It actually represents maybe 4 billion years of Earth history. But the different periods at the top are based and divided on different types of fossils and different events which happened through that first or most recent 550 million years of geological time. There are very few fossils in the rock older than 550 million years. So this period tends to be just very often just labeled as the Precambrian. There are people who study it, and it's a very interesting period, but very difficult to study. I said the geology in the Burren is relatively straightforward. All the rocks that we're going to talk about in a few minutes belong to this period here. This is called the Carboniferous period. And one date there that I want you to try and remember, if you're not familiar with this kind of information, just try and keep in your head 330 million years. And I know all this COVID-19 stops and we're back able to walk in the Burren. If you're out walking with some friends, you could maybe stop and pick up a rock and maybe tap it, maybe hold it up to your ear, and then knowingly say, oh, I think this rock's about 330 million years old. And you wouldn't be too far wrong. But the Carboniferous period actually spans from about 360 million years ago up to about 300 million years ago. So it has a span of 60 million years, and it's divided, further subdivided into different stages, and those stages are further subdivided into different formations. But we don't need to worry about any of that, any of those terms. We're going to keep it as simple as we can this evening. What I do want to do, though, is put you in a time machine. And we're going to go back to the Carboniferous period, 330 million years ago. So we're right back here, we step out of our time machine, and everything is different. You're not going to recognize a single plant, a single animal. Even the geography of the world is completely different. So a little bit confused, what we might try and do is head down to the local bookshop and pick up an atlas. And even an atlas doesn't help us very much. It's all quite confusing here. So you're looking at this atlas and you're wondering, where am I? If you look carefully down on the right-hand side, down near the bottom, you'll actually spot Ireland and Britain down there. And if you look carefully, you'll see that we're actually south of the equator, and between us and the equator is Greenland. A little bit to the west, short drive away would be North America, and just south of us then we've got Africa and South America, not too far beyond that. So this is what the world looked like in the Carboniferous period. And we know that from study of plate tectonics. And plate tectonics is a fairly recent branch of geology that's been able to explain all the major features on the surface of the Earth. It explains where volcanoes and earthquakes occur. It explains why you get mountain chains in certain areas and why you have deep ocean trenches in other areas. And it's all based on the idea that the surface of the Earth, the crust of the Earth, is made up of different pieces, different semi-rigid plates, which are all moving independently on the surface of the Earth. So in some places, these plates are sliding past each other. In other places, they're moving away from each other. And in other places, they're moving together. And those different movements account for all these different features that we see on the Earth's surface. As an idea, it was first kind of seriously suggested in the 1920s by a German called Alfred Wegener, but he wasn't able to explain how it was happening, and it really didn't catch on as much of an idea. Following the Second World War, there was a lot of research done on the sea floor, different features which were found on the sea floor, and the idea of plate tectonics really came together just in the 1970s. So it's really only an idea which has come together in the last 50 odd years. I started my geology degree in 1979, and this was a fairly new idea at that time. Nowadays, of course, we can prove it very easily with GPS tracking. We can actually measure the exact movement of these different plates. So that's a quick introduction to geology. The main things that we're going to cover in this talk, what I would normally do is look at the formation of the three rock types that we find in the Burren. I look at the impact of tectonic forces, the impact of plate tectonics on the Burren area, and then we'd move on to look at the erosion of rocks and the development of the Burren landscape. But just to keep things to a reasonable time span tonight, and maybe leave scope for somebody else to do a second talk further on. I'm just going to stick to these two main topics tonight. So we're going to be looking at the three rock types and the impact of tectonic forces on those rocks. So let's go back to that geological column. And I said we don't really need to know all these different stage names and learn that they're divided into different formations, but there is a major division in the middle of the Carboniferous period, and it's divided into the lower and upper Carboniferous. The lower Carboniferous is the period where we get all the limestone deposited, and then the upper Carboniferous, we have a major change in the conditions, and we get shales or mudstones and sandstones deposited. And this division is pretty much widespread, certainly across Europe and Britain and into North America, because at the time, these areas were all very close together. So we have the similar kind of division of these rocks. And the Carboniferous period itself has actually been intensely studied because the upper Carboniferous is where most of the world's coal resources are found. So since the start of the Industrial Revolution, these areas have been these rocks have been very carefully studied. Let's start by going back to the lower Carboniferous. This is our limestone period. So at that time, where Ireland was a shallow, warm, tropical sea. We saw the map earlier on. So we could think of this as something like maybe what the Bahamas look like nowadays, or the Great Barrier Reef. And we know that by looking at the rock and looking at things that we can see in the rock. And the main ones are the fossils. And fossils are the remains of organisms that were living when these rocks were being formed. So as they died, their remains are trapped and preserved in the rock, and they tell us the type of environment that these rocks were forming in. So corals are amazing animals. They live in a very close symbiotic relationship with algae, which are plants, so they need lots of light and they need clean water. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend a documentary on Netflix called Chasing Coral, which is mainly about the impact of climate change on these corals. They need a very particular temperature range to survive in. But there's some amazing footage of modern day corals in it. They're very common in the limestone of the Burren, so they tell us quite a lot about the conditions, the sea conditions where these rocks were forming. Another common type of fossil are brachiopods. These are a type of seashell, something similar to a clam or a cockle, but a brachiopod was a bit different because it was fixed onto the seabed. So if you look on the bottom left-hand side here, you can see a modern-day brachiopod. So it's an animal living inside two parts of a shell, but the two shells are different shapes. One part of the shell has a small hole in it where a stalk emerges, which fixes that animal onto the seabed. Very common in the rocks of the Burren as fossils. You'll either see semicircular shapes like these ones here, or sometimes you can get full circular shapes depending on how the rock surface is cut through that shell. And very occasionally you'll get a full three-dimensional shape of that shell as it breaks out of the limestone, as the limestone weathers away. And sometimes you'll see that full three-dimensional shape. And the other common type of fossil then are crinoids. These are quite curious animals. They are animals that look a little bit like trees. You can see in the middle there, but they're actually related to starfish or sea urchins. These animals had a long stalk at the bottom, made up of bony plates, and then the body section was in the middle here, and there were arms and tentacles up at the top. And all these separate bony plates were held together while the animal was alive by a tissue layer around the outside. But once that animal dies and the tissue decomposes, all these bony plates separate, and what you'll often see in the rock is just these little round shapes that look a little bit like polo mints, and these are the individual plates that made up this animal. So by looking at the fossils that we see, we find out something about the environment that the rock was formed in. If we look at the whole of the Burren, there's about 500 meters of limestone. This represents about 20 million years of deposition. So the conditions in this ocean stayed fairly steady for 20 million years. Slow subsidence, so we get this continual deposition in this shallow ocean environment, shallow marine environment. It's divided by short horizontal or horizontal breaks, which are called bedding planes, and these represent just very short breaks in the deposition of that limestone material on the seafloor. But there is one part of the limestone sequence which has more dramatic changes in it. And this is very visible as you drive around the Burren. You see these cliff edges. If you've ever walked up, anybody who's walked up Blackhead will be familiar with these. The first part of the walk from the lighthouse up to the ring fort is a very even slope. And then after the ring fort, you're picking your way up through these very steep cliffs and terraces. And these all formed on one particular unit within the limestone sequence. It's called the Isle Member. It's about 130 meters, and it consists of 11 or 12 terraces. And in between the terraces are what are called wayboards. So wayboards look like this. They're these shale beds. Shale is a very soft, flaky type of rock, normally kind of dark grey colour. Sometimes they contain quite a lot of iron, as you can see the rusty colour in here. In the Burren, they're generally only about 10 centimetres thick. They sit usually on a very uneven basal surface, and then the top surface is normally very flat. And they're quite hard to see if you're walking in the Burren, because what tends to happen is the rock is so soft, the shale is so soft, it weathers out, and then the rock above it collapses and falls down and buries these features. But you can see them in some of the caves. A really nice example here in one of the caves near Carran. You can see this orange layer here, which is the Wayboard. So again, these tell us something about what was happening during the world in this Carboniferous period. So here's our map of Carboniferous world again, an island marked here close to the equator. During the Carboniferous period, there was glaciation, so we had ice sheets forming. So in the normal conditions, we have shallow water and we have limestone forming on the sea floor. During glacial periods, when we get a buildup of ice at the North and South Pole, sea level drops. So where we had these shallow marine conditions, sea level drops, and what was the sea floor then becomes a land area. So you start to get erosion of the limestone surface, you get small karst features. That's giving us that uneven base to these Wayboard layers. You'll get sediments forming on the surface there as clays or sometimes soils. And then as the ice melts, sea level rises up again and you're back to limestone deposition. So these Wayboards are primary features, they're original sedimentary features within the limestone sequence, but they have a really strong influence on the landscape features, the landscape development, and also on water flow within the limestone. Another feature which is very common in the limestone is something called chert. And this also occurs as what seem to be flat layers. You can see in the bottom left-hand photograph here, but it's actually not an original deposit within the limestone. Chert is made of silica, and it's formed from the remains of various microscopic organisms which live in the seawater but have a skeleton made of silica. As these creatures and organisms die, there's a rain of this material down onto the seafloor, and it mixes with the original limey sediments that make the limestone. But during compaction and compression of the limestone sediment, the silica actually goes into solution. It migrates through the limey sediment and tends to form in layers relating to the bedding planes. So although it appears as an original feature, it's actually a secondary sedimentary rock within the limestone. So if you look at a geological map, we can see that most of the Burren, most of this map is grey, that's the limestone area, but down in the south west corner, down by Doolin and Steinman, we have different colours, and here we have the shales and the sandstones, which are from the upper Carboniferous period. So we move into something quite different. This is 20 million years. We've had 20 million years of limestone deposition. But then at about 325 million years ago, the conditions in this sea change. The sea floor subsides, and this seems to be due to a very old plate margin deeper in the crust of the earth becoming active and causing subsidence. So we get a small marine basin forming where the water is too deep for coral to survive. And we start to get these very fine-grained muds depositing as shale. So you can see them in the photograph there. Very, very soft material, very black because of a lot of carbon that's in them. If you pick them up and move them in your fingers end up black from the carbon, and you can see the orangey, rusty colour because they contain a lot of iron. And these things indicate that these sediments were formed in a very low oxygen environment. This shallow basin was a marine basin, but very little oxygen on the sea floor, and we can compare that with something like the Black Sea nowadays. This rock is sometimes called pencil rock. Some of the locals call it pencil rock, and I'm not sure if that's if there's any origin from that. If it was actually used as a pencil, it certainly would mark anything because of the carbon in it. So what we're looking at is the formation of a small marine basin, and North Clare was right on the margin of this basin. If you look on the left-hand side there, you can see a red line from North Clare down to the Shannon Estuary and across to North Cork. And if we look at the sequence of rocks along this line, we can see how the type of rocks and the thickness of the different beds of rock changes from Doolin here on the left, across to Carrigaholt in the middle, and then across to North Cork. These different thicknesses have been recorded in boreholes and different exposures, and it shows that we have this subsidence of the crust and the development of this basin, which then began to fill in with sediments. So the first sediments are the Clare shales, and they're called Clare shales, but the Clare is very much on the margin of the basin. And typical fossils here are these lovely spiral goniotites. And this is a free swimming animal. These were swimming around in the water, probably at the top of the water. We also have shark's teeth, so thought maybe the sharks were chasing the goniotites. That was a simple little food chain there. On the top of the right, we've got these lovely little delicate bivalves. These things were probably living at the top of the water column, and deeper down there was this very low oxygen environment, as you can see suggested in the diagram on the lower right. Some recent things have been found which tell us a little bit more as well. Dr. Eamon Doyle is with the Burren Geopark just recently found some vertebrate fossils of this little amphibian. And these have just been published in a journal last year. These were found at Doolin. And another interesting fossil found at Doolin is a very old flying insect. This was actually just found by a UK geology student who was on a field trip here back in the 1990s. So geology is a developing science. New things are always found. The other interesting thing about the shale is that at the base of the shale is a very unusual deposit, which is a phosphate bed. And phosphate, one source of phosphate is from fish teeth and bones. It indicates very, very slow deposition. So we have this deep oxygen poor environment with very little sedimentation happening in it, just this very slow build-up of material forming this phosphate bed. And this was mined near Doolin during World War II for use as fertilizer. And a recent or very recent paper by Pat Cronin, who lives in Doolin, did some research on the mines at Doolin. You can see the workings there. So some of this was open cast mining, some of it was underground mining, and started in the 1920s. But once the Second World War had finished, these mines were closed down. But there were about 100 people working there. And it's really hard to imagine Doolin as a major industrial centre, but for a short period of time there, it was. And we move up from the Clare shales into the upper Carboniferous sandstones. These are very well exposed at the cliffs of Moher. There are two main units that we see in the northern part of County Clare. The first one is the Gull Island Formation. And this is represented by some strange sediments which show a lot of slumping and sliding. So we're looking at sediments which were deposited, sandy sediments which were deposited on the margins of this basin. Again, we still have this fairly deep basin. And as the sediment collected on the margin of the basin, every so often it would become unstable and it would slide and roll down the edges of this basin. So we get a lot of these slumping and sliding structures, and also these very curious sand volcanoes. These are nothing to do with the type of volcanoes you'd find in other parts of the world. These are sedimentary volcanoes formed where you get this semi-solid sediment landing on top of a very wet sediment, and the pressure of the upper sediment squeezes water up through the overlying bed, and it squirts out and makes this little volcano structure. So quite curious little features, but again they tell us something about the environment that they were formed in. Above the Gull Island Formation we have the central Clare group, and these are typified by very symmetrical ripples. So these are the type of ripples that you'd see on a sandy beach, and they're formed by gentle water just lapping backwards and forwards and forms these very symmetrical ripples. So these tell us that this basin at this stage is more or less filled in, and we're looking at quite shallow water. The fossils we find in these sandstones, again, we've got these gonatites, these nice spiral fossils, but a lot of plant material, and then these very curious trace fossils that we see in the sandstone beds and the flagstone beds. Still no definite idea of what animal made these. They're not an actual animal, they're not the actual worms, but they were probably made by some type of worm burrowing through this material when it was still soft sand. So the environment we're looking at here is of a deep marine basin, which is slowly being infilled by rivers, probably coming in from the west, where of course nowadays we have the Atlantic Ocean, but at this time this was America, this was the continent of America, and rivers flowing across that land area, depositing sand into this basin and gradually filling in that basin. So our upper Carboniferous sequence here starts with the shales, goes through several types of sandstone, and then ends up with shallow water sediments at the top. So that's our basic sequence. It's just 3 different types of sedimentary rock, going from the older limestone up through into the younger sandstones. But if we look at our geological map again, we can see that up at Ballyvaughan we have the limestone at sea level, but by the time we get down to Liscannor and Lahinch, we're looking at sandstone at sea level. So all these rocks have been tilted or tipped to the south. So we have a basic structure, as you can see here. This is due to plate tectonics. It's due to what's called an orogeny. This is what's called the Variscan orogeny. An orogeny is when 2 plates move together and the sediments between them get squeezed and deformed. So we're looking at our sediment deposition about 330 million years ago. But then by 280 million years ago, these rocks were being squeezed by these moving plates. And most of the compression, because of this plate movement, happened through Central Europe. So Ireland wasn't very badly affected by this. If we look at this map, we can see areas which have been badly affected by this deformation. But in Ireland, it's really just the areas around Cork and Kerry where we see any intense deformation from this period of plate tectonic movement. If anybody's walked in Cork or Kerry, you see the sandstone mountains there, places like Carran, and if you look at the layers of rock, they're very steeply dipping because of this plate tectonic movement. What we see in the Burren is just a small amount of folding, and it's best displayed here at Mullaghmore. So you're looking here at Knockhanes Mountain, and if you look carefully at the layers of rock, you can see an arch in the area here going from left to right. You can see an arch structure, and then across to the right you can see that's called the arch is called an anticline, and then the downward fold is called a syncline. And if we scan across to the right, you can follow these layers of rock in this kind of roller coaster ride of folds coming down to Mullaghmore itself, there where the big synclinal fold is. So one of the amazing things about this type of rock folding is that when the rocks are being folded, the layers of rock actually move over each other. They scrape past each other as the rocks are folded. And because of the amount of exposure we have in the Burren, we can see evidence of that in what are called slick and slides, these gouges, these grooves in the rock. They're quite visible in places in the Burren, but the problem with the Burren is that because the rock is limestone, whenever it rains, these features erode away very quickly. But on the left-hand side there, you can see some other examples which I photographed in a cave, where obviously they're going to be preserved for a little bit longer. The main feature that we see because of this plate tectonic movement is a series of fractures through the limestone rock. And these are calcite veins, so the rock was pulled apart by plate tectonic pressure, and then little cracks were filled in with calcite. What normally happens is that these get eroded out and they form the grikes, the open channels that we see on the surface of the Burren. But around the coast, you can still see where there's calcite in these veins. And they vary from quite fine little veins, the ones on the left there maybe just a centimetre wide, through to the one on the right, which is near Blackhead Lighthouse, which is about 1 metre wide. And these are very pervasive right through the Burren. Nowadays, with our wonderful access to aerial photography, we can see this really clearly. So on the left-hand side there, you can see a Bing image of Blackhead right up in the top left there. And if you look carefully, you can see the ring fort above Blackhead there as well. But if you look at the rock, you can see this grain, this texture in the rock, which is all these tiny little veins picked out by the weathering and erosion. You can see it there in the oblique view on the right-hand side there. And this structure is really pervasive right through the Burren. This is Sleipner Glacier, just to the southeast of Carran. And again, really clear examples of these veins opened up to form the grikes. And in this image, you can see lots of the karst features, lots of small little dolines, small little craters which have formed on these structures. And this is Turlock Hill, just behind the outdoor centre where I work. And again, you can see lots of these lines, these fracture systems going through the rock. Now, I know Turlock Hill really well. I don't know how many times I've walked up there, but one of the small little features on the hill is this small little mine at it. So this only goes in for a couple of meters, but you can see that it's located on a big example of one of these veins. And if you look at that vein carefully, you'll see that the vein material is actually not calcite, but is silica quartz, one of the most common minerals on the Earth's surface, but not very common in a limestone area. And if you look really carefully, what you see is that there are pieces of limestone mixed in with this silica vein material. So what this is telling us is that some of these veins contain material which is quite exotic to the limestone. It's come from possibly further down in the sedimentary sequence, and it was actually blasted up into the limestone, fracturing the limestone as it came up. And in some places, mainly around Carran, some of these veins actually contain more exotic minerals. And again, there's some small examples of mines there where they were looking for galena, which is a lead ore, sphalerite, which is a zinc ore, and chalcopyrite, which is copper. So again, somewhere like Carran, you don't think of it as a mining area, but there was some very limited mining activity there in the 18th and 19th century. So what's happening here again, this is related to plate tectonics. We're looking at this compression of the rock as these plates were moving, with the rocks were squeezed in a north to south direction. And that means that the rocks are going to expand and extend to the east and the west in the opposite direction. So well, this is quite minor. You get small little veins which will be filled with calcite from the limestone host rock. But around Carran, we have much deeper veins coming from the rocks which are underneath the limestone, bringing up these more exotic minerals in the veins there. So these veins are really important in the development of the landscape and the karst features. So we've recently found a cave close to Carran which really clearly shows some of these features. And the cave itself is quite deep and follows a series of these silica veins deep down into the limestone. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a feature which was uncovered when an area of hazel scrub was cleared, quite close to Carran again. But this feature was completely unknown. It was completely buried in the karst, or completely buried in the hazel. But again, it's related to these vein features. So they can be followed on the surface. We can pick them out. Because they're made of silica, they don't dissolve as quickly as the limestone in rainwater. So as the limestone dissolves away, these features are left as upstanding features, some of them quite large, as you can see here. And there's a recent paper published on the origin and nature of these veins by John Walsh, who's a professor of geology in UCD, and has done a lot of work on the veins and fractures in the Burren and across the rest of Ireland as well. It's a fairly serious paper. I wouldn't recommend reading it if you don't know too much about geology, but if you want something a little bit easier, I'm going to finish up with this paper here, which is, or this map here, which is a map that we put into a paper I wrote with David Drew. This is based on some field mapping that was done by Conor McDermott of the GSI back in the 1970s and 80s. But he did incredible field mapping, incredible detailed work, but it was never published until quite recently when his field maps have become available online. But I've used some of his maps and put together this kind of composite image showing the different layers of limestone, the different rocks, and also the different structures. So we're looking at how these different features, the different karst features that we see across the Burren relate to the geology, and there's strong links between the different features and how water moves and erodes through the limestone. So I'm going to finish up with that. Thanks very much for listening. Strange times I know we're in, but please stay safe and stay well. So just follow those health guidelines, and hopefully we'll get to the end of this at some stage. If you're sitting at home with lots of time, there's lots of information about geology online. The Outdoor Education Centre, the Geopark, the Geological Survey of Ireland. And if you want more information on caving, then the Clare Cave Club is on Facebook. So thanks very much for listening. Hopefully there's no questions, but we'll find out in a minute.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to stop sharing your screen, Colin, so we can see you better then? That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Colin, and a wealth of information there. And I'd say might help that a recorded version of this webinar will be available on YouTube so people can revisit it, you know, because there's a lot of concepts and words and jargon there that I found hard to absorb, and that'll stay in my brain.
Yeah, it takes a little while to get used to all that language, but hopefully the kind of ideas will spark the interest, and people will have a look at it again maybe.
I was wondering, is there any ongoing research, geological research that is happening in the Burren at the moment? Or is there any research you would like to see happening? Is there any unanswered questions?
So some of the recent work I mentioned there, just in the last couple of years, is Eamon Doyle's found some very interesting fossils. He's the geologist with the Geopark. And then I was working with John Walsh on some of the work on the veins. The Wayboards are still really unstudied in Ireland, and there is somebody, I believe, from America who's based in UIG in Galway, who is, I think, going to do some work on those Wayboards, because they're a really unknown quantity in the limestone sequence.
What do you mean by Wayboards? Can you explain?
So the Wayboards are these shale beds that I mentioned during the presentation, and they represent periods when sea level dropped, so that the limestone that was forming on the sea bed then became a land area, and you get a deposit of a different type of rock on top of the limestone, and then it changes back to limestone again. So they record something very unusual that was happening when these rocks were forming. So there's probably a lot of information in them, but they haven't really been studied in detail yet.
Thanks, Colin, for the talk. There's a few questions here. So one is, are there still caves in Burren that haven't been investigated?
Well, nobody knows. I would say almost definitely yes. There are a lot of missing links in the cave systems. So caves are formed by water flowing through the limestone. So there's a lot of places where we know water goes into the ground, and we can put dye or traces into the water and we can see where it comes out. And if there's no known cave system between those 2 points, there has to be something there. Whether it's big enough for people to get into or not is a big question. But new caves are regularly found in the Burren. Every couple of years. New caves will be found. The one that I mentioned in the presentation there is Poll Gonzo, close to Carran, and that was the scene of a lot of work over the last couple of years. But there's some really interesting geology and hydrology in that cave.
Colin, there's another question here. What type of rock underpins the limestone? This is a slightly long question, so I'll keep going. What is the depth of limestone in the East Burren as opposed to the High Burren? at what rate is the limestone being eroded by rainwater?
Okay, lots of questions in there. What was the first part?
What type of rock underpins the limestone?
Okay, so it has been believed that the granite that you see in Galway extends under the parts of the northern part of the Burren. But GSI, a couple of years ago, started drilling to try and get down through the limestone and see what was actually underneath the limestone. And they were drilling at the GAA pitch near Bell Harbour, and I believe they went down 600 or 700 meters, and they didn't get to the bottom of the limestone. So, to be honest, we don't know what's under the limestone there. The fact that we have these veins that I was talking about in the presentation as well would indicate that certainly under some parts of the Burren, it goes down to older sedimentary rocks. So I said the limestone is Carboniferous, it's about 330 million years old, but there are lots of older sedimentary rocks which would underlie that limestone sequence. There were other parts to the question as well.
Well, at what rate is the limestone being eroded by rainwater? Would you know that?
Well, that's an interesting question, which lots of people have tried to figure out, and there's no kind of agreed rate. The way you can look at it, the way it's normally looked at, is by looking at what are called erratics, which are rocks which were moved by glaciers during the Ice Age and then deposited on the limestone surface. And once they're deposited on the limestone surface, they act as a kind of umbrella, and they protect the solid piece of limestone directly underneath them. So the limestone all around these features is eroding away, but directly underneath that erratic, you get what's called a pedestal, which is a piece of solid rock protected from the erosive effect of the rainfall. And in the Burren, they vary from generally about 10, 15 centimeters. Some have been recorded up to 45 centimeters, but there's a lot of debate about how those features actually form, whether there was soil in the Burren before. There's a lot of questions about those figures, but let's just say quite slowly.
Okay, Colin, the green sections that you have in the Burren, are they glacial deposits, and if so, when would they have been kind of dumped there?
The green sections.
Oh, sorry, the green field. You know, you get
green
fields
yeah.
up in the
green fields. All those green fields. There's a big contrast in the Burren between the kind of bare, rocky hillsides and the very green, better pasture land, generally lower down in the valleys. All those green areas are on glacial deposits. So it's the Burren was covered by ice at several occasions, and the ice, as it's moving over the landscape, will erode a lot of rock, and then the ice melts and that material is deposited onto the surface. So anyway, where you see those lovely green fields in the Burren, that's almost always glacial material, yes.
And when is it hard to tell kind of when, which ice age, or, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have some ideas about that, which are very early stages of development. It's very difficult to date that material. There is one location on the west coast where it's been dated because some of it occurs in a cave, and I think there's a date of about 18 or 20,000 years ago. That's all. Glaciation is quite a recent event compared to the geology that I've been talking about.
The next question from Gordon Darcy. Thank you, Colin, for the wonderful lecture. Can you tell us about the granite which underlines the Burren? Is it a continuation of the South Connemara granite, and is it the edge of a batholith?
Well, as I said earlier on to one of the other questions, there was a drilling attempt to try and see how far or whether the granite actually did occur underneath the Burren limestone, and as I said, they went down 600 or 700 meters and didn't find any granite. So it may be that there's granite under there. We don't know. But if there is, then it is probably an extension of the Galway batholith. Yes.
Colin, you explained this from John Cross. You explained the north-south fractures, but how were the east-west fractures formed?
Okay, well, the main trend of the grikes is north-south, the tectonic features that you get in the Burren. But if you walk on a piece of limestone pavement, you will see fractures in other directions as well. And the current idea is that they are mainly kind of decompression fractures, if you like, from erosion of overlying rock, or possibly even just from the ice, the weight of the ice on top of the rock. From the ice age, when that ice melted, the rock kind of expands outwards and you get those other fractures there. But the main fractures, the main geological tectonic fractures, are almost all north-south.
Mm-hmm.
This question probably doesn't relate directly to the geology, but has the historic mining damaged the areas in question?
Not really. It was a very small scale. Certainly in Carran, it was very, very small scale. They're literally just scratchings on the surface, and you see no evidence of it. The mining in Doolin was certainly more extensive, and some of that was open cast. But it's, I think there are still spoil heaps. If you look carefully there, you will see some of the spoil heaps. But they've all grassed over. There's no obvious sign of it anymore.
Joe McDougall wants to know, has climate change had much effect on the Burren, in your opinion?
How do we answer that one? Not that I'm aware of at the moment. And people talk about a new geological period called the Anthropocene because of the impact that we're having, but in my experience, I'm not aware of it. I don't know any research on it. There was a study when Money Point, which is a coal burning power station that opened in West Clare. When that opened, there were worries that sulfur dioxide would have an effect on the landscape, and it was monitored by ESB as far as I know, but they didn't pick up on any evidence of an increase in the acidity in the rain or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Colin, are there specific landscape features where the rock type changes from the limestone to the shales?
Well, that's where a lot of the swallow holes are formed. So the shale is effectively impermeable. It's a waterproof rock. So where you have shale outcropping at the surface or sandstone on the surface, this acts as a catchment area for rivers. Rain that falls onto those areas will form streams. And where those streams reach the limestone, where they come into contact with the limestone, that's where you'll get your sinkholes or swallow holes. That's the acidity, the natural acidity in the water dissolves away the limestone and starts to go underground. So that's where you find most of the sinkholes and swallow holes.
Perfect. I suppose we'll just go for one last question each. On my side, are there any gemstones found in the Burren, Colin? Gemstones, sorry. Gemstones.
No. Well, you find the only one I suppose you might call a gemstone is fluorite, which is a lovely purple color, but it's a very soft rock. It wouldn't really last as a gemstone. So it's found in some of those veins that I mentioned, and in one or two other situations. Not very much of it, and it wouldn't really be much use as a gemstone, I'd say.
Okay, I'll take the last question. So it's from somebody, Dr. Sweeney. How much of the country is covered in limestone?
Of the whole country, about 50%. If you look at the geological map, about 50% of it is covered by limestone. Most of the Midlands, and most of it is very flat-lying. The thing about limestone is it dissolves in rain. In this country, we have lots and lots of rain, so most of the limestone has eroded away. The Burren is quite unusual in being an upland limestone area, but that's probably a topic for another talk, I'd say.
Well, listen, Colin, we just want to thank you very much for joining us this evening and for your very informative talk. I'm sure there's a lot more questions there, and we can send them on to you as well so you can have a look at them. Just for anyone who joined slightly late or wishes to share this talk with friends and family, the recording of this talk will be up on Firmbio's YouTube channel within the next day or two, and then all the recordings from previous webinars, if you missed any of our previous Wild Wednesday webinars, from the last 5 weeks. They're also available on Burren Bio's YouTube channel. So next Wednesday, we have Farming for Nature Ambassador and Market Gardener, Kate Egan, who runs a viable business from her 9-acre farm while also continuing to enhance and build up the biodiversity on her land in County Westmeath. So do join us. You need to register for this, so you can either do that through the homepage on Burren Bio or the homepage on farmingfornature.ie. And then, Pranjali, is there anything you'd like to add?
I just have a couple of news items. One is that we are in the process of developing an online version of Burren and Bloom this year. So between 3rd and 6th of June and 7 and 9 p.m. every evening on over those 4 days. So expect panel discussions and presentations and quiz and workshops and fun bits as well. So we will send you a registration link for the Burren and Bloom online, or you'll probably find it at www.burrenandbloom.com. So feel free to register for it, even though the full program isn't out yet. That, and if for those of you who are interested, you might already know there's a lovely program on the Burren called On Burren on Tijikahar that starts this evening at 9:30. So I think the talk today by Colin will give us a better appreciation of programs on the Burren in the future. So that's really it. Thank you so much, Colin, once again, and to all our attendees.
Next week.
See you next week.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you.